Thank you all again for continuing to be here. Administrator Dixon, I want to follow up about the rudder cable on the 737 MAX. As you know, at least half a dozen of the FAA's own technical specialists, as well as an expert panel established by the FAA's safety review process, raised serious concerns that the rudder cable on the 737 MAX could be severed if the engine failed, causing pilots to lose control of the aircraft. This concern is not just a theoretical concern. The FAA guidance is rooted in the tragic 89 DC-10 crash in Sioux City, Iowa. And 112 people died in that crash. In your response to Chairman DeFazio and the Aviation Subcommittee, Chair Larson's letter on this issue, you said, "We followed the FAA procedures, except that doesn't seem to be the case," which we'll get to in a second. There's a kind of cornerstone of the FAA procedures, which is that the components will become safer over time. Seems like a good kind of rule of thumb to follow. So when the FAA reviewed and approved the 737 NG model, the FAA found that the 737 NG had a lower risk of a severed cable than the 737 Classic model. And the reason that the risk was lower is because the engine on the 737 Classic was more powerful. So based on the determination that there was a lower risk in the 737 NG, it was approved. So there's a 1997 issue paper for the 737 NG that warned that engines in the future on 737 models, if they got bigger, it would increase the risk of severing that cable, and that additional steps to protect the cable would be needed. Which brings us to the 737 MAX, which has a bigger engine and potentially greater risks of severing the cable. The FAA, though, didn't require any design changes. Instead, it ignored that 1997 warning. So my question is, why didn't the FAA follow the guidance from the 97 issue paper and require additional protections for the rudder cable?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to respond. And you know, this is, I think it's important to understand that, you know, these debates and discussions among subject matter experts are part of what gets us to a safer system. And there are a couple of different approaches that can be taken in these instances.
Do those approaches include ignoring an issue paper?
Well, no, I'm just saying that there are approaches there are prescriptive rules and that can be followed, and there is also sometimes data that can be applied based on the performance of a proven system. And in this case, the team looked at, eventually when the decision was made, looked at the mitigations that had been put in place in terms of floor structure and also the casing around the CFM LEAP engines and the reliability of those engines and the fact that they are already certified essentially from their initial manufacture as capable of extended twin engine operations, which is an extremely high level of reliability. And so taking all of that into account, there is actually a risk in adding complexity to an improved system that was put in place in the 90s to deal with the hard-over rudder issues from the accidents that we talked about earlier. And when you introduce a fleet that's got additional complexity into an operation that's already got thousands of airplanes out there that have different maintenance practices, that itself creates a risk. And so that's how that decision was made. And remember that the manager who's making that decision is actually a technical expert himself, yes.
Or with
FAA,
Boeing?
yes. No, at FAA.
Okay. So the concern here is that, first of all, you're talking about increased complexity and not following the guidance that had previously been stated, and not doing a new type certificate. So I think there are a lot of inconsistencies in the way that you're describing this process. And the overarching concern is that the process for safety reviews is becoming either inconsistent or more lax, and that control is being increasingly delegated to the manufacturers. So I think that I obviously have run out of time, but I do think that there needs to be some serious consideration around you have said yourself, this is a whole system, and across the system, we have been hearing inconsistencies and places where it seems as though the FAA has been more lax. And I think that that's something that we can address and need to address. I yield back.
I can assure you we will not be lax, and actually, I believe that the decisions that we're making are going to be more rigorous because of the reliance on data and performance.
Okay, thank the gentlelady and the gentleman. Representative